Welcome to this video on the city of Paris. The idea of the video is to provide you some information on the city of Paris, similar to what you would usually expect from a city tour, so that you can better understand the city, enjoy it more, and appreciate it to its fullest. And unfortunately for you, I love history, which means that there will be plenty of it in the video. Let's start with the disclaimers. This video is regarding the Paris located in France and not the one located in Texas. Sorry, I will have to do another video at some point to cover that one. So let's start. When thinking on going on holidays, Paris is usually on top of the bucket list. It's a city well known for its architecture, its food, and its fashion industry. Every year 50 million tourists visit this city, which is an astounding number. One of the main questions that may come to your mind when thinking on Paris, or any city in general, is where does the name come from? In this case, the name comes from the tribe that inhabited this location before it was conquered by the Romans, by Julius Caesar and Labienus, which means that Paris is indeed a Roman city. Unfortunately for you, you will not find too many Roman things, but it's good to know that it was a Roman city. There is an amphitheater, but that's pretty much it. Since I want this video to be as short as possible, we will skip more of the Roman part. The only thing I consider particularly relevant has to do with Christianity. And Christianity is important because France is still Christian. Most of its citizens still consider themselves Roman Catholics. And as something you will visit a lot in Paris are churches, it's definitely good to know something about Christianism. So, what are the two names you definitely have to remember? The first one is Saint Denis, who basically brought Christianity, and Saint Genevieve, who convinced the citizens to stay in Paris during a Hun attack. You will definitely hear about the latter in the Pantheon, and Saint Denis is so famous that he has a basilica you should definitely visit, which contained all the remainders of the French kings. Let's fast forward the Roman Empire collapse and the initial chaos of the barbarian tribes. Because as mentioned, this is not a history video, just let me know if you would be interested in one of those. But for now, let's go to 987. This is when Hugh Capet appears. He is, as you might have already guessed, the founder of the Capet dynasty, and the reason why he is important is that he decided to locate himself in Paris. Additionally, he would be extremely lucky with heirs and the heirs of his heirs, meaning that all the French kings until the revolution would be his descendants. He established himself in the Ile de la Cité, where he would build a palace for himself and a chapel. So this is when we can finally make a connection with the reality and talk about the Ile de la Cité. This is one of the oldest parts of the city. The main reason is that after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the whole continental Europe became more dangerous and they had to protect themselves. The citizens decided to go to this island in the middle of the Seine because they would be more protected from anyone trying to steal their goods. And that's why some of the oldest buildings are located here. We can talk about two main sites, the Notre Dame and the Sainte-Chapelle, and you should definitely visit both of them. Let's start with Notre Dame. The construction of Notre Dame started in 1163, and it's famous for being the Cathedral of Paris. It has a beautiful Gothic style, so beautiful that the design would be copied in other European countries, and it would survive up to our times, in which it even survived a recent fire. The Sainte-Chapelle is not such an old building, but it anyway dates to the 14th century. The French king at the time, Saint Louis, was a very religious person. That's why he is called Saint Louis, because he was made a saint. And during this period, he tried to support the Latin reigns in Jerusalem by exchanging money for relics. So he eventually realized that he had too many relics and that he needed a place to store them. The storage he created is indeed the Sainte-Chapelle. It's another beautiful building in Gothic style, and I would definitely recommend visiting it. And we can now take a quick look at the right bank of the Seine, where we will see the Louvre. It was originally created as a defensive fortress to protect the city from the English, but it would later on become a royal palace. By understanding the story of the Louvre, we can understand the story of the whole city of Paris. So we can briefly go back to the boring historical part. We left Hugh Capet in Paris, and just mentioned that all the French kings would be his descendants. This is absolutely right, but something even more remarkable is that him and his descendants would be able to have male heirs, which means that not only would they remain in power, but they would also be able to absorb other smaller domains, such as counties or duchies. And this is why Paris is the most important city in France, because all the power concentrated in Paris. There was, however, a remarkable exception. The one that would cause the 100 Years' War. During this period of time, the English would contest the Kingdom of France, and there would be battles all over France. At some point, the French kings had to leave Paris, which even fell to the Burgundians. Therefore, the kings had to search for a different location, and they chose the Loira Valley. That's the reason why there are so many castles in this region. And during their absence, the palaces of Paris would deteriorate. That's until Francis I would decide to come back to Paris. So once he came back, he had some fortresses available, but that was pretty much it. So he decided to establish in the Louvre, which as said was originally a defensive fortification, and decided to make it fit for him. Since he had been in Italy fighting some wars, he had got acquainted with the Renaissance style, so he decided to renew the castle using that style. Of course, the current Louvre that you see is not what Francis I did. His palace would only be the central part, and the wings are a posterior addition. Some decades later, Catherine de' Medici would decide to build a palace for herself. This is the Tuileries Palace. It's unfortunately no longer present, as it was demolished after being set on fire during the Paris Commune, but the gardens are still present, and they now look like a perfect addition to the Louvre. From this moment onwards, both buildings would go through some reforms, adding additional pavilions and wings to eventually end up connected to each other. Remarkably, some serious reforms were performed in the 19th century, and the current look of the Louvre basically comes from this time, with the final addition of the pyramid. This glass pyramid is extremely recent. It's from the 1989, so it basically comes from our contemporary times, which means that some of you might be older than this pyramid. Great, we're done with the Louvre Palace, so let's go somewhere else. Even though the main idea of the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace was to build an extremely big palace complex with multiple wings, multiple buildings attached to each other, someone didn't like the idea. She was a regent queen and she was a Medici, so she had more the Italian vibes. That's why she wanted to have a different palace, she didn't like the Louvre. So she decided to build the Luxembourg Palace. It's called the Luxembourg Palace because next to it there was a hotel owned by someone with the surname Luxembourg, and in its origins, the palace was an Italian Renaissance building. And that's its origin. Afterwards, the palace changed hands. It ended up with some other members of the nobility. It eventually became the seat of the French Directory, then the Senate, and then a museum. And of course, during the 19th century, they would reform the palace and provide the vibes that you can actually see in there. So even though its history is not particularly mind-blowing, it's still a really nice place. It has some nice gardens, so it's a really nice place to go to and enjoy. Great, too much sightseeing, so let's go back to the boring historical part.
Back to work, everyone.
During the 16th, 17th century, there was a lot of problems with religion, which, well, we're not really going to talk about them in this video. Then we have a series of kings, they rule, they do what kings do, and we eventually reach Cardinal Richelieu. So you might be thinking, why is this person important? That's a really fair question. The thing is that at some point, France started having some lazy kings, and they didn't care so much about these kind of affairs. So they would nominate a deputy to take care of these matters, and Richelieu was the first one of this kind. He basically ruled in Paris, and he built some things here and there. And if you are quite curious, his figure is quite important because he was one of the first ones to start this centralization approach in which all the power of France should be in Paris, which is basically what happens nowadays. So the tendency basically established. After we get Cardinal Mazarin, who's a really interesting figure, and we are of course not going to talk about him. And finally we have Louis XIV. You have probably heard of him. It's quite significant to mention that while he was young, there was a nobility uprising called the Fronde, which means that for some time he had to flee from Paris, from the amazing Louvre, and go to a nearby palace. This was quite a traumatic experience, and that's why he decided in the future to move his residence away from Paris to Versailles, and to go to Paris only when strictly required. It is nonetheless a good idea to ask ourselves, how was the Paris at that time? And it was honestly not a bad place. Cardinal Richelieu had taken care of the city, so that's when you start having La Sorbonne, for example. There were more buildings, more bridges in between. Before, people had to cross in a ferry, and now you could cross the Seine directly using a bridge. The number of rich people and of nobles increased, so there were better buildings. The population in general also increased to around 500,000 citizens, which means that the Paris of this time was one of the major cities in Europe. Of course, if we were to travel back to that city, we would definitely hate it, but considering the standards of that time, it was actually quite a nice place to be in. And if you are wondering what's the most relevant building that Louis XIV left in Paris, that's definitely Les Invalides. You could of course mention Versailles, but that's technically not in Paris, that's why we don't consider it, even though you should of course go to Versailles. Okay, but Les Invalides, so what's this place? This place, as you might infer from the name itself, was a hospital. The historical context is that Louis XIV decided at some point to get in war with every possible neighbor, which meant that he had many casualties and many injured soldiers. So he built a place, a hospital for them, and that hospital is called Les Invalides. This location still exists, but it's no longer a hospital. During the 19th century, it was converted into Napoleon's mausoleum, and it was of course extended. In the beginning, it was a rather small building. If you go now, you will be impressed by how many buildings it has attached to it, so it's a massive complex nowadays. And going back to the historical part, since the main topic of the video is Paris, we are now entering the 18th century. The 18th century tends to be quite complex in every country. But for the sake of this video, since the main focus is Paris, the most relevant fact regarding the monarchs is that they stayed away from Paris. So they stayed in Versailles. They would come from time to time, but they would mostly stay outside of Paris. This didn't mean that Paris got worse or it stopped growing, because Paris was already a rich city, which means that they did not only depend on the monarchs to maintain the city or to build it. Around this time, the Industrial Revolution had already started to take place, so there were more goods, people had more money. Therefore, if they simply wanted to build a new house, they could do it. This is why Paris did not collapse, but you could notice that the kings were not around. And this can be linked with the process of the Enlightenment. This was the time in which scholars would meet each other, they would talk about politics, philosophy, how to structure a society, these kind of topics. And it's when they started to envision a society without kings. No more kings! Which is the ideology that would later spark the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. So what can we rescue from this time? Basically cafes, plenty of them, which I think is one of the main things that tourists do when they go to Paris. They go to one of these cafes and they simply drink some coffee. You can also drink other things. I had quite a nice hot chocolate, for example. And apart from that, we also have the Pantheon. The Pantheon is that building that you can see from almost anywhere in the city. From the Ile de la Cité you can definitely see it, and especially its massive dome. This building, even though it doesn't look like one, was supposed to be a church, but during the French Revolution and afterwards it was transformed from being a pure church into being a building for appraising the revolution. And it's where many scholars, writers, politicians would be buried. And finally we get the French Revolution. I will disappoint everyone because I'm not going to touch this topic. Don't get me wrong, the French Revolution is really important. We are heirs of that revolution, but for a video on Paris, what to see, how to understand the city, it's not particularly relevant. But I will provide a brief summary. So, in a nutshell, Paris was in quite a dire situation economically. Peasants were hungry, so there was not enough food. Therefore, there were major demonstrations and protests. The king thought that gathering people from all over France in the States General could help to solve the situation. He couldn't have been more wrong than that.
So the tables have turned.
So some people tried to put into practice the theories that the scholars from the Enlightenment had created, and it went quite bad. There was plenty of chaos, internal revolts, France declared war to all its neighbors, there were quite some coalition wars, then Napoleon would appear, he would crown himself emperor, there would be more wars, and eventually one of these coalitions from all the other countries but France could be able to defeat France, and they would restore a monarch, Louis XVIII, putting an end to the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Which doesn't mean that the ideas were forgotten, they would continue and they would shape how the future would look like, including our modern times. And I can use this as a segue for the Bastille. In 1789, the Parisians assaulted the Les Invalides, the military hospital we've left behind, and they obtained weapons, specifically thousands of guns. The problem with guns is that you need powder in order to shoot them, otherwise they are really expensive sticks. So they went to the Bastille to get the powder, the Swiss guard tried to protect the Bastille, and the Parisians ended up storming it. The Bastille was simply a fortification. It's coming from the 14th century, together with the Louvre, when the kings were trying to protect the city of Paris during the 100-year war. After that, it had been used for multiple purposes, including a prison or an armory. And you might be wondering, can I visit the Bastille? I have some bad news. After the storming and during the French Revolution, they decided that the Bastille was a symbol of oppression, so they decided to tear it down. Which means that if you now go to the place where the Bastille once stood, you will see a square, which is quite nice to be honest. It has a pillar in the center with the date of a bunch of revolutions that took place in Paris. Also the symbol of some elephant, because at some point there was an elephant over there, but that's another story. So that's what you can find. Luckily, during some constructions, they found part of the Bastille which was underground, and they placed it somewhere else. So you can go there and not only see the Bastille, but you can also touch it. And this brings us to the 19th century. As mentioned before, here we have the Restoration, so Napoleon is gone, and the forces of the coalition decide to restore the French monarchy. That's why this period is called the Restoration. However, many things had changed in France, so it was impossible to go back to the old system. In the old regime, the church and the nobility would have some power, and they would be counterparts to the king. However, in this new system, the monarchy would have more power than before, which is a paradigm, but that's what happened. The Restoration would last 15 years, until 1830, when there was a revolution called the Revolution of the 1830, and after that another king would rise to power, called Louis Philippe, who would last in power for 18 more years, so until 1848, when another revolution, yes, you've guessed it, is the 1848 revolution, would replace him for a republic, the Second Republic. Most of the effort in this period was used to restore Paris. Due to the revolution, it had been damaged, so some buildings were restored. Clearly not the Bastille as we've seen before. The Restoration period wasn't particularly fond of Napoleon for obvious reasons, but Louis Philippe was. That is why during this period of time the Arc de Triomphe was finalized. This is one of the most famous monuments in Paris. It's quite hard to miss and you should definitely visit it. It was built to honor Napoleon's victory in the Battle of Austerlitz, and now it's one of the most famous roundabouts in Paris. Going back to the Second Republic, this one would last 4 years. Yes, it was extremely long. It would have precisely one president, Napoleon III. And after 4 years, since he couldn't go for re-election, he performed a coup d'etat and he declared himself emperor.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
And this is one of the most important moments for the history of Paris. So why was this? We must now imagine France in the middle of the 19th century. So the Industrial Revolution was already quite established, which meant that the population was way more productive than before, and there were more resources available. Additionally, it is in this period of time when people start coming from more rural areas, from towns to cities, to urban locations. Therefore, the cities became more important, and in the moment you take many people and you place them in the same location, that will cause massive overhead in order to control that and ensure that people's living conditions are adequate. This is why Emperor Napoleon III decided to make the city a more livable place. And for that, he thought that people needed fresh air and ventilation. Which is indeed true. That's why he took the old medieval Paris and he decided to demolish all those complex structures in the city where you would have many small roads and small houses, to make huge avenues and boulevards, and to standardize the buildings. That's why whenever you go in Paris, all the buildings are going to look really similar. He didn't do this by himself, he had Baron Haussmann, who ideated the plan and he set it up in 3 stages. So they basically started in different zones of the city. And the approach they followed in order to reform the city was to have them decide what the rules for the new zone would be, and then the private sector, banks and construction companies, they would reform the zone. And as you can see, it worked wonders, because the majority of Paris looks like that. And as a curiosity, even though the official reason for the reform was to open the city and increase the amount of fresh air, another hidden reason was that they wanted to get rid of the medieval Paris, because it had a really complex structure and it was really easy to put barricades. They thought that the reason why they were having so many revolutions and the revolutions were taking effect was due to the effect of the barricades, and that if they simply didn't allow that to happen, they would be able to keep them under control. That's why they built these big boulevards. Because if there's any kind of problem, you can have a cavalry charge. Having said that, it wasn't particularly useful for Napoleon III because he also fell to another revolution. At least he wasn't in Paris, so we cannot blame him completely on that one, even though he basically brought it upon himself.
Inspirational. What have we learned?
So what do we have from this time? Basically everything. almost any street you go to will look like it looked after the reform. All these big boulevards, all of them are coming from that time. The facade of most of the buildings, it's also coming from this time. For example, the Louvre or the Luxembourg Palace. Their facade comes from this period in which they were trying to make the city look beautiful. And to their credit, they actually made it. And now let's finish with the 19th century. After the fall of Napoleon III, a tumultuous time began. It is called the Paris Commune, it definitely deserves a video only by itself. So in a nutshell, a revolutionary commune took over Paris and they tried to become independent from the rest of France. Of course, France didn't allow this, so we have a beautiful period of time in which there were German troops surrounding the city, and simultaneously the French government was trying to take control of the situation in Paris because it was controlled by the Paris Commune. This finished greatly, with quite some damage on the city and the burning of the Tuileries Palace, which was never rebuilt. It was luckily a short period, and after that things went back to normal. Afterwards, it's usually claimed that the period of the Belle Époque starts, in which France and Paris become worldwide known and they become one of the major exporters of art. Additionally, the Sacré-Cœur comes from this time as well. The building is quite interesting in itself, but it's definitely worth it for the views. And finally, during this time, the Universal Expositions were really trendy, all across the world. Every country would try to have an exposition in order to show to the rest of the world how advanced they were. Similarly, London and Barcelona would have many expositions. And of course, Paris wanted to do the same. That is why for the exposition of the 1900, the Eiffel Tower was built. It was originally going to be a temporary thing, but they decided to keep it. And with this, we definitely finished the 19th century. And since the video is already long enough, we will not stop too much in the 20th century. During this time, Paris was still a cosmopolitan city, and they simply keep doing a bit the same. The First World War started, but it didn't reach Paris, so there wasn't much destruction. Between the wars, not much happened either. There were mostly political conversations, and then the Great Depression came to finally start the Second World War, because it was taken over by the Germans at the time. Luckily, there was hardly any destruction, and after the liberation, Paris went back to where it was before, which meant mostly focusing in art. When I say art, we can definitely think of paintings, but they also exported, for example, their architecture or their entertainment with the cinema, and that would enter in the current period. But this is out of scope of this video since I wanted to focus on the historical aspect.
It's over now.
So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe and click on the like button in case you liked it. And most importantly, let me know in the comments what you would like to see next in this channel. See you the next time.